Good to see y'all again. Thank you so much for being here. I said this up top, but I want to give it one last time just in case anybody came in late. This is primarily targeted toward parents. If you have a child with you, heads up, we're talking about sex today. So if you don't want to have uncomfortable conversations with your child, you may want to go check them into our children's programming. Valentine's Day. Valentine's Day is tomorrow. Valentine's Day, I did a little bit of research on the history of Valentine's Day, nothing too epic. But, Valentine's Day is one of those days that kind of gets a bad rap because it's like, Hallmark created it just to make money. But actually, Valentine's Day was first declared a holiday in the 5th century by the Pope at the time. And it was named after St. Valentine, and there's different, kind of beliefs about who St. Valentine was and what he did and all that. But ultimately, Valentine's Day becomes associated really with romance because, and I think it was primarily in England and France, it was believed that this was about the time that bird mating season began. And so that's kind of where the tie came into romance. The first Valentine ever that was sent, like a Valentine, like someone wrote a Valentine to someone else, the first Valentine that was ever sent that we have on record was in 1415, and it was a poem sent from a prisoner in the Tower of London. They wrote like a love poem and sent it to someone. 1840s, the 1840s, that's the first year that Valentines, like the cards, were actually mass produced to give them out on like a big scale. And so today, we spend $145 million on Valentine's cards every year, just within kind of our culture. And so this is the season. This is like within our world, within our culture, this is the romantic season. This is kind of when everything builds. And so this is why we chose to do this series right now, because it's the season of romance. It's everywhere you go. So let's talk about it. So that's why we're doing this 3-week series. We kicked it off last week. It'll actually finish up next week. But we're doing this 3-week series called The Best Blank Ever. And each week, we're kind of filling in different topics. In case you weren't here, here's the topics we're going over. Last week, we went over marriage. This week, we're talking about sex. And next week, we're going to talk about dating. And so we kind of put this one in the middle because this is like the kind of interesting, fascinating, weird, strange one where people wonder, like, when you go to church, you talk about sex. What do you actually talk about at church when you talk about sex? The sad reality is usually when churches talk about sex, it really just ends up creating a lot of guilt. If you've been around here, you've probably heard me talk about my past and my story. I grew up going to church. I've been in church my whole life. And so I was a kid in youth ministry during like the 1990s, which is the heart of what's known as, they call it purity culture. And if you grew up in church at that time, you may know what I'm talking about, or even maybe you've heard other people talk about it. But essentially, purity culture was like this. They didn't call it purity culture at the time. It's like people looking back at it saying this is what it was. But the essence of purity culture was during that time, as a student, as someone who's in youth ministry, like a big part of the core of your Christianity had to do with you waiting until marriage to have sex. And I want to make this clear in case my youth minister or anybody from my church ever watches. I did not feel like this in my youth group. I don't think that. But even when we would go to camps, when we would go to conferences, when you'd listen to music, things that were marketed toward churches, marketed toward teenagers, that was the overwhelming thing. And the message of it was, if you waited to marriage to have sex, your life would be good, your marriage would be great, and everything would be great between you and God. But if you had sex before you got married, then you were dirty and you were polluted and things were going to go terribly in your marriage with whoever your spouse was, and it was just going to be bad. And so what's interesting is I don't again, I was a high school student. I don't know like where purity culture started. I don't know. And I think it was probably rooted in good intentions. Like people wanted people to live, hey, let's live a pure life. Let's live a life that is a full life. But it ended up being, I think, really damaging for a couple of reasons. One is it put a lot of guilt on people. Because again, the central message of purity culture is, hey, if you wait till you're married to have sex, then everything's going to be great and but if you don't, then you're polluted before your spouse, you're polluted before God. And so if people had sex, then there was this like, well, I'm a failure, I'm dirty before God, I'm dirty before my spouse, I'll never have a good marriage, I'll never have a good family, I'll never have this future in this life that I always want. The other thing it did was you had people who believed that, hey, if I just wait till marriage to have sex, then when I get married, I'm going to have a great marriage, everything's going to be perfect, and it's going to be awesome, and my life's going to be incredible. And so people waited, and then they got married, and they learned that, you know what, even if I waited till marriage to have sex, we still have marriage problems. We still fight, we still argue. This wasn't like this this paradise that was promised to me, that if I just waited, then everything would be great. And so you had a lot of people that ended up getting disillusioned because they're like, look, I did what you asked me to do. And it's not that sex and marriage isn't good, but it's not what it promised. And so I want to be like really clear as we start to talk about this today. This is not about judgment or condemnation. I don't want anyone to walk out of here feeling dirty. I don't want anyone to walk out of here feeling like, dude, God just beat the crud out of me and I feel like I'm that's not it at all. We're not here to judge. We're not here to condemn. We're not here to criticize. None of that. What I want to do today is I want to talk about really what sex is, like theologically, what sex is when Jesus or when the writers of specifically the New Testament, the writers of the Bible, when they talk about sex, what is sex? But I also want to talk about what sex has become in our culture. And so I want to begin by looking at something that Paul writes to the church in Rome. And so Paul is the guy who's most responsible for spreading the church and Christianity all over the Roman Empire. Paul is a devout Jew, but he ends up going to all these major cities. Ultimately, he ends up in Rome. When he writes Romans, he has not been to Rome yet. But he travels all over the Roman Empire, and he starts churches, and he's largely responsible for kind of the expansion of Christianity over the Roman Empire. And so this letter that Paul writes to the church in Rome, Rome is the heart of the empire, right? The heart of, and so this church in Rome, this is made up of Christians from different backgrounds, people who are following Jesus, but they are in the heart of a city, of an empire that is hostile to them and is kind of hostile to their way of life and what they do. And Rome, interestingly enough, much like our culture today, Rome is a very sexualized culture. It is. Sex is everywhere, and sex, you can do anything with anyone you want. And so Paul's writing this letter to this group of Christians in the heart of Rome that really in some ways kind of lives in a similar situation to how probably many Christians would describe life in the country and the culture that we live in now. And in Romans 1, Paul is talking to the church in Rome essentially about why people do the things that they do. Why people live the way they live, why people make the choices the way that they live, and it's all kind of complicated, but here's what he says in verse 23. He says, they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. And so what Paul's doing here is he's referring specifically back to a story that comes from ancient Israel's past. There's this famous story called the Exodus where Moses leads the Hebrew people out of slavery in Egypt. They settle down in Canaan and they become the nation of Israel. One of the key parts of that story is one time Moses is up this mountain talking to God, and the people in his absence melt down all their gold and jewelry and they create this idol and they start worshiping this idol instead of worshiping God. And so this is the reference that Paul's making here. But what he says is profound. He says what they did in doing that is they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for something else. So what you have to understand for Paul is that for Paul and for the earliest Christians, God was not like this private thing. In our culture, one of the things we've done with God, we've done it really with religion in general, is religion is almost like this private thing. There's like the public life and there's everything that's public, and then whatever your faith is, whatever your religion is, that's private. So as long as you keep it privatized, everything's great. Don't bring that out into public. That's not for public. That's private. Do whatever you want in private, and then in public, we just kind of don't talk about that. So we privatize God, we privatize faith, but for Paul and for the early Christians, God wasn't like this private thing. God was the center of all truth and reality. God was the thing that everything else hinged on. So you couldn't privatize God and it's like, well, God lives in the public. No, God is like all-encompassing of everything. And Paul's point here is he says, listen, when you move God somewhere else and you place something else in the position that's only designed for God, there are consequences to that. This is what Paul's getting at. He's saying, listen, people have taken the space that's supposed to belong to God, the significance, the meaning of God being the foundation of everything, the thing that everything else hinges on. They've moved him somewhere else, and so in his absence, they have to replace it with something. And he's referencing, again, this Israelite story with this idol made after an animal, but it doesn't have to be an actual physical idol. It could be something else, anything else, a person, a relationship, a philosophy, a pursuit. When you place something else in that spot that's supposed to belong for God, there are consequences. And Paul goes on the next verse and he says, and here's the consequences when you do that. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator. And so Paul says the consequences of taking God out of the spot that belongs to him and putting something else in there. And the word he uses is interesting. He says, because people did that, God gave them over to these desires. Now, the way that's worded, the New Testament's originally written in Greek, and when you read it in Greek, when he says God gave them over, that's not like active discipline. It's like a passive acceptance. And let me explain the difference. As a parent, when it comes to like discipline or when my kid's learning lessons about what you should do or what you shouldn't do, sometimes I have done that actively in their life. Sometimes it's happened passively. Active is when like you actually discipline someone. Like a child does something wrong, and so you ground them or you take something away. You're going to look that I would describe that. That's like active discipline. I'm choosing to take this as a result of your choices. I'm taking this from you, so now you have to suffer the consequences. But I've also seen my kids learn lessons like in a more passive way. I remember when my son was really little, like he was at that point where he was starting to get up and walk around, but he couldn't make his way around the room unless he was like leaning on furniture. And they kind of scoot to the couch and they scoot to the next. And so it's just him and I, my wife was at work, we're in the front room and he's kind of making his way around and he gets to our TV remote control, which at the time we had one of those universal remote controls, it's like 4.5 feet long. It's like this big old like thing. And that's in there. And he picks up this remote and he like smiles like he's proud of himself, like he'd been trying to get this. And I went over and I took the remote from him. Because, one, I didn't want him to chew it. I didn't want him to break it. It's just nothing good was going to happen with him with the remote. So I took the remote and I set it down on the coffee table. And I said, no, buddy, no. Don't leave that there, no. And he got like this like kind of devious smile and he made his way, again, over to the coffee table and picked up the remote like, I got it. And so I went one more time and I took it from him. I said, no, buddy, trust me, you don't want this. And this time I set it like on the end table by the couch. And he saw me set it over there, and he got that like devious smile. And so he made his way, scooted his way off the furniture to the couch, and he held up the remote, and he smiled. And I was like, fine, you can have it. And I think inside he knew he won because he got really excited, and he started shaking it and smacked himself in the face with it. He just was like, yeah, oh! And then he dropped it, and he started crying and bawling. And like the good, compassionate dad I sat there, and I was like, I told you, bro. I told you. I did go over there and give him a hug and everything. But it was like, I didn't actively do anything. But it was like, I kept telling him, you don't want to do this. But he kept insisting, no, I want to. And it hurt him. That's more the passive thing. The way that Paul words this is what Paul's saying. Paul's not saying that God actively did something. What Paul's saying is, listen, God kind of passively accepted that this is what people wanted to do. And so God said, okay, if this is what you want to do, here it is. So again, when you go back to verse 23, you put verse 23 and 24 together. Here's what Paul's saying. Paul's saying when you take God out of the place that belongs to him and you put something else in there, the result of that is you end up living to gratify your own desires. Now, the problem with that is that the way you and I were created doesn't necessarily coincide with what our desires are. Sometimes we desire things that are counter to our own benefit, to our own health, or to our own well-being. And so Paul's point is, it's not that God's punishing people, but it's that people have actively chosen to ignore God. And so in God's absence, now their primary pursuit in life, their primary goal in life is fulfilling their own desires. And see, this is one of the big rubs between Christian faith and between the culture in which we live. Now, when we talk about culture, I think it's important to define what we mean when we say culture. Because sometimes people talk about culture and the cultural values. When we say culture, what do we mean by culture? This is not mine, I didn't come up with this, but this is my favorite definition of culture. Most of it comes from a guy named Leslie Newbegin, who was a British missionary and everything. But when we're talking about culture, this is what we mean by culture. Culture is the ways of living built up by a group of human beings and passed down from one generation to the next. So culture, the interesting thing about culture is not created by God. Culture is created by human beings. When a group of human beings is together, they either intentionally or unintentionally create a culture. And a culture is kind of everything around us. It's the values, it's the beliefs, it's the traditions. All of that kind of reinforces culture. And so every group that you are a part of has a culture. Your family has a culture. If you have a job, your workplace has a culture. There's a culture of, if your kids go to school, there's a school culture. We have a church culture. Southern California has its own culture. California, the United States, like all of that. And the interesting thing about culture is as people, we create culture, and then culture creates us. Like we form a culture, and then that culture forms us, because every culture, every single culture, wants to conform you into its own image. That's the power of culture. That in your family, whether your family is good or bad, like you may have a dysfunctional family culture, but that dysfunctional culture keeps trying to form you into a dysfunctional person. No matter how much you try to resist it. That's the interesting thing about culture, is we form culture and then culture forms us. You and I, in a broad scope, we live in what's known as like a Western culture. And most sociologists will actually define it as a Western secular culture. See, when you get into other cultures, there are some cultures that are very religiously based. But the Western culture is what's known as a secular culture. It's a culture that's trying to form itself apart from religion or faith or God. Again, because even in our culture, in our country, we have what's separation of church and state and all of that. And so a big part of our culture has been shaped by science and reason and humanism and a lot of things that come from this movement that we know as the Enlightenment. And so what's interesting is our culture has a story that it tells about us as people and the journey that we are on. Now, Christian faith also has a story that it tells about us as people and the journey that we're on. What's fascinating about the cultural story and the Christian story is they really begin very similarly. They begin in the same place, but they end in drastically different places. See, here's the kind of the Christian story and the cultural story side by side. Okay, the Christian story, and again, this is like when you look, this story is within the Bible, but it's kind of like the big picture of the Bible when you look at it. The Christian story begins with creation, that a good God creates a good creation. But then sin enters into that, and there's a fall, and somehow all of creation becomes corrupted. God then comes down in the person of Jesus to redeem creation, and ultimately the goal of it is restoration, that God is restoring all of creation. This is, like, again, in a nutshell, this is the Christian story. Creation, fall, redemption, restoration. Culturally, here's the story that our culture shares, is there's innocence. Like when we're little, we have this innocence about us. But then somewhere along the line, there's pain. And that pain could be things that we experience, just the world that we live in. It could be tragedy, it could be abuse, whatever it is. But with that pain comes a loss of innocence and a loss of who we were. So then we have to discover our true self. Who am I really? And so a lot of what you see out in our culture in terms of marketing is, hey, find your true self and live your best life and you be you and do your own thing, because we're trying to find what it is that we lost. And then when you find your true self, when you discover who you really are, that's when you live this life of pleasure and happiness. You can only live a happy, full, pleasurable life if you find who you are, like in your truest self, that you lost somehow in this pain. And so when you look at these stories, what's interesting is they both start off in the same place, that there's kind of like this ideal, but then that gets lost. Something happens and there's a loss of that. But from there, they go in very different directions, because the cultural story is all about what we do for ourselves. That we are finding ourselves, that we are finding our own way out. We're digging our own way out, and it's by recovering who we truly are. Whereas the Christian story is rooted outside of us. It's what God is doing for us. Redemption is not what we do for ourselves. Redemption is what God has done for us through Jesus. And so while the stories start off very similar, they go in very different directions, because one is about me finding my own salvation, and the other is about God saving me. And here's why this matters. I know you're like, I thought we were talking about sex. We're not really talking about that much sex. Here's why this is important, okay? Because a big part of our cultural story in finding our true self and living this life of pleasure and happiness is sex. Sex and sexuality is one of the keys in our cultural story to finding out who we really are, living our best life, being our true self, and ultimately living a life of pleasure and happiness. There's a journal, it's called Leave-In Journal. And in an article for Leave-In Journal, Laura Buffington wrote, it's really kind of an interesting article. She wrote this article about sex in movies. And when you get to the sex scene in movies, like what is the significance of sex scenes in movies, and how do the movies that we watch, how do they portray sex scenes? And here's what she writes, and it's really insightful. I'm going to read it to you. Here's what she says. She says, sex is the moment in films when people are saved from their flaws. Characters overcome commitment fears or trust issues. They escape from the extreme stress of trying to save the world. They escape the boredom of their mundane existence. Sex can be a moment of defiance or rebellion when a character becomes more fully herself or himself by breaking convention. Sex provides motivation for the action hero, hope for the lonely romantic, and ultimately satisfaction for the people watching at the afternoon matinee or Friday night date night. Whether it's a Hollywood blockbuster, a primetime television show, or a song in the top 40, we find a culture where sex does more than sell. Sex saves. And see, this is why we get so passionate when we talk about sex. This is why whenever someone says anything that seems to like put boundaries on sex or sexuality, or whenever someone says anything like, you can't just indulge everything, the reason why we push back, the reason why we get so defensive is because sex is a means by which we are saving ourselves. And so if you are somehow trying to cage my sex or my sexuality, you are literally cutting me off from one of the primary means of salvation. This is why people get so defensive. This is why we get so passionate. Because in this cultural story, sex is a huge part of what saves us. And if you are trying to put boundaries around that, or you're trying to limit that, or you're trying to tell me what I can and can't do, then it's not just you telling me who I can and can't sleep with. It's you telling me that I cannot be saved. See, that's the rub. That's one of the big rubs. That's the rub when it comes to sex. But that's one of the big rubs between Christian faith and between the culture in which we live in. Because see, Jesus, if you go back to Jesus, when Jesus talked about life, and when Jesus talked about living a full life, for Jesus, living a full life was not about indulging all of your desires. In fact, it was the polar opposite. For Jesus, living a full life was rooted oftentimes in denying some of those desires that we have. In Mark 8:34-35, here's what Jesus said to his followers. He said, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. See, Jesus understood. He goes, listen, our desires as people, the things internally that we want, these internal desires, just because we have them doesn't mean they lead to a full life. A lot of the internal desires we have, in fact, are quite destructive to us and to the people around us. So for Jesus, when he talked about living a full life, he said if you really want to live a full life, if you want to live this life of abundance, then you need to learn self-control. You need to learn that it's not about indulging all of your desires. But see, again, in a world, in a culture that's all based around, I have to save myself. I have lost my innocence. I have this pain. I have to rediscover my true self. This is a harsh statement because it's like, no, you're denying me that now. You're denying me the only means with which I have to save myself, which is my pursuit of pleasure and happiness, and I can do whatever I want as long as it leads to my pleasure and happiness. Now, Jesus, this is really important. Jesus, at no point, even though he's talking about, he's talking about here kind of denying our desires, Jesus doesn't ever say sex is bad. It's not bad. It's not bad at all. It's part of the way God has created us. It's part of what God has given to us. Sex is not bad. Jesus is not saying that you should never have sex. He's not saying that sex is evil. He's not saying that sex is wrong. He's not saying that sex is bad. In fact, really the one time where Jesus is asked about anything to do with sex, it's actually a question about divorce more than anything else, but when Jesus, the one time he's asked about marriage and sex and sexuality and all of that, here's his response. Here's what he says. He goes back by quoting from the book of Genesis, which, again, interestingly, if you look at the cultural stories, he goes back to before the fall, before the loss of innocence, before the pain. Jesus goes back to the way that things were created. Not the desires that we have, but the way that we were created. And here's what he says. All right, some Pharisees came to him to test him. They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. And so the one time Jesus talks about this, he actually goes all the way back to the very beginning and says, let's talk about what it was supposed to be before the fall, before everything went bad. And listen, sex, when you talk about sex, yes, it's about pleasure. It is. Sex is about reproduction. That's how we make babies. But for Jesus, it's a lot more than that. For Jesus, sex is this intimacy that exists between two people who are in this like one flesh union. Sex is the ultimate example of intimacy. It's the ultimate way two human beings come together in the context of two people becoming one. Again, we talked about this a little bit. This is kind of the idea of marriage. We talked about this last week. I'm not going to get back into marriage. But sex is a part of this. And Jesus says that's the context in which sex thrives. The interesting thing when we talk about sex is this weird kind of, it's this ongoing thing that, again, whether you've been married for 2 days or 4 days, whether you've been married for 50 years, like even when you put it in the context of a marriage, like sex is kind of this up and down dynamic thing, and it creates dynamics within people. I remember when I was in high school and when I was in college and even as a young adult out of college, what's interesting is the couples I knew that were having sex, they fought more. They just did. What's really fascinating is the longer that you're married, couples that have sex less fight more. So there's just interesting dynamics within sex. And again, I'm not a psychologist. There's just interesting dynamics in sex and what it does for us and how it connects us as people and what it does in and out of certain relationships. But again, Jesus' whole point, here's Jesus' point, is sex is at its best. The way it's designed to work is in this context of two people who have committed to this one flesh union for each other. When Jesus talks about sex, he says, this is where sex works. This is where sex functions. Because, according to Jesus, this is how you were designed. It may not be what you want. It may not be what your impulses are. It may not be what your desires are telling you. But this is how you were created. Now, I know some people are going to say, like, well, as long as there's commitment, then we don't need marriage. I mean, we don't need the label of marriage. If you're saying it's just about commitment, then we don't need the label of marriage. And I'm not trying to be mean. I'm not trying to be critical, but, like, if you're not married, you're really not committed at that point. You can walk away at any moment and there's no consequences to you. The whole point of marriage is that you're choosing to bind yourself to a person in a way that's not easy to get out of. So when you come home and dinner's burnt, you can't just walk out the door and be done. Or when your team beats their team in the Super Bowl, you just can't walk away and be done. There's a lot more to it than that. And so I would argue, and Jesus would argue, and the New Testament would argue that no, marriage is key to that. And so here's the point. Like when you bring it all together, this going back to everything that Paul said, what happens in our life, what happens in our culture, is when we take God out of the place that was only designed for him, we end up becoming, in Jesus' words, we become slaves to our own desires. And so most of us live our lives at the beck and call of disordered desires because we have placed something in the position that should only belong to God. And so as a result, now we're looking for things like sex to save us. That sex is an idol in most of our lives. Because we're looking for it to give us something that it never can. So again, this is the problem. This is the problem not just with our culture, but even at the beginning when I talked to you about purity culture, that's one of the dangers too with purity culture. Is purity culture taught you all along that, man, if you save yourself toward marriage, then when you get married, sex is going to be great and it's going to be phenomenal and it'll be perfect and everything. And so you have these people that waited, and then when they had sex and they got married, they were like, really? That's all there was? I thought there would be more to it than that. And there's like this epic letdown because there's this promise of it's going to deliver something that it can never deliver. Again, I'm not saying sex is bad. Sex is great. Sex is a good thing. But it's not like this savior. It's not going to make everything in your life perfect. It's not going to make everything in your life great. It's not going to save you. It's not. We have to stop trying. We have to stop expecting something from sex that only God can give us. And so the thing with sex is when we start talking about sex, if we just start talking about who I can and who I can't have sex with, like We're just going to argue and we're going to yell. Really, the way that we recover sex doesn't even start with sex itself. The way that we recover sex is we put God back in the place that he rightfully belongs. Because let me just tell you this, love, acceptance, meaning, significance, you're not going to find that in sex with anyone. You're going to find it in God. And when you have that in God, then all of a sudden that opens you up to enjoy other people, one of which being sexually with a spouse, with a husband, with a wife. See, when the New Testament writers, when they talk about sex, it is this great thing. It is this ultimate intimacy and unity between two people. But it's two people who don't need each other to complete each other. That's a classic Jerry Maguire line, right? You complete me. That line's total crap. It's total crap. Okay, I love my wife. I adore her. I think she's the most amazing person on the planet. She doesn't complete me. She makes my life better. She makes my life fuller, but she doesn't complete me. I am a complete and whole person because I'm a child of God, made in the image of God. And through the death and resurrection, I am being restored. And what I have in Jesus allows me to enjoy my marriage and to my wife and to the people around me. The problem with sex in our culture is we have put so much on it. This is why one of the reasons our over-sexualized culture is dying. Because what we're learning is that sex can't save us. It can't. Because in the wrong context, all sex does is produce guilt and shame and pain, and it numbs us, and it cuts us off from ever actually being able to be intimate with anyone. See, the way we experience fullness in sex, the way we experience fullness in life, is to get our desires back in order, which begins by putting God back in the place that he belongs and letting him reorder our desires. So we live our lives in pursuit of him. Then we become free. See, that's the irony. We always tend to think of, well, if you put boundaries on sex, you're taking away freedom. No. See, us engaging in our own internal selfish desires, that's, according to Jesus, that's slavery. Freedom comes when we put our desires back in order, beginning with God, and let him reorder our desires so that we can be free to enjoy the life that we were created to live. Sex and sexuality always going to be a huge part of all of our lives. Always is going to be. And in its right context, it is a beautiful gift. Taken out of that context, it is extremely destructive to us and to the people around us. And again, I don't want anyone to walk out of here. I don't want you to walk out of here feeling guilty. That's not the point is that wherever we've been, wherever you are, whatever your life has been, whatever your journey has been, whatever your past has been, is what God cares about far more than your past is your future. And futures begin when we put God back in the place that he belongs and then let him reorder our lives. That's what I want for all of us. I want a beautiful future, thriving in all areas of our life, including when it comes to our sex and our sexuality. Let me pray. Father, I thank you for your love for us. I thank you for everything you've given to us. God, I thank you for sex. I thank you for the gift that it is. And God, I know that we live in this world, we live in this culture that most of us, if we're honest, even those of us that probably go to church all the time, we're trying to save ourselves. We're trying to discover, what is it that I need to do? How do I find my true self? And God, I'm not trying to bag. I'm not trying to make people feel guilty. And I know there is work we all need to do in our own lives. But Father, the reality is the most important work is the work that you did through Jesus. And that's what's saving us, and that's what's restoring us. But God, whenever we place idols in the position that only belongs to you, our lives get disordered. our desires get disordered, our passions get disordered, and we end up becoming slaves to the things that are inside of us. These desires that oftentimes are destructive. They're destructive to us, they're destructive to the people around us. I mean, you look at our culture, you look at the world we're living in, and we're just dying. We're dying personally, we're dying relationally, we're dying as a culture, we're completely falling apart because we're just slaves to every little thing we want. Because we think that's what's going to save us, and we think that's what's going to give us pleasure. We think that's what's going to give us meaning, and it's not. Sex doesn't give our lives meaning. God, sex is a beautiful, intimate thing between spouses, between a husband and a wife who are sharing this life together. And in that context, God, it brings fulfillment. It still is difficult. It still is challenging at times. It's not the answer to everything. But it's this beautiful part of two people becoming one. But outside of that, God, it can be so incredibly destructive. Father, my hope is instead of focusing first and foremost on sex as a thing, God, that we focus first and foremost on you. Because reordering our desires begins with placing you at the top. Because once we place you there, God, then you, through your Spirit, through your power, can help us reorder our disordered desires and be free to live a full life. God, we love you, we thank you, we pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.